health issues, and it's complicated. I think we are live.
Yeah, I'll share,
Not
put my
yet.
screen up.
Jane, would you like me to start letting people in?
Yeah, go ahead, Dom. We'll get started in just about a minute. We want to give everyone a chance to get into the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Well, we'll go ahead and get, oh, we've got someone waiting to come in. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we've got most everyone in the webinar with us. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining this workshop as part of World Parks Week. Today, this session, this workshop, is the second of two World Urban Parks and Salzburg Global Seminar joint hosting webinars focusing on urban parks and urban futures. This workshop is Urban Parks, Urban Futures, and why parks and urban green spaces are fundamental to quality of life in cities around the world. Our goal with this workshop is for participants to leave with up-to-date research and evidence to help advocate for the importance of urban parks and green space. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers and host. My name is Jane Miller, and I'm the chair of World Urban Parks. With me today, I'm really honored to have these professionals with me who are going to be sharing research and data that is contemporary about the benefits and importance of parks and for urban cities. First is Irene Gatto. She's a technical assistant with Ancion City, Green City, the United Nations Development Program from Paraguay. And I'm also really honored and pleased to say that Irene is also one of the fellows as part of the Emerging Urban Leaders Program, being co-hosted by Salzburg Global Seminar and World Urban Parks. Welcome, Irene. Also with us is Brice Robertson. She is the Director of Partnerships and Strategy with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy from the United States. Brice, thanks for joining us as well. And finally, we have with us Kevin Roth, who is the Vice President of Research, Evaluation, and Technology with the National Park and Recreation Association here in the United States. During our webinar, their bios will also be posted in the chat room. So feel free to pay attention to the chat room. I want to take a few minutes to share some housekeeping. We always have to do that. We're used to this doing Zoom for now the past year in our lives. But our format today will, first of all, each speaker will have speakers present for about 40 minutes. And at the end of the presentations, there will be a question and answer period for about 20 minutes. The total session time is 60 minutes. This session is also being recorded and will be recorded throughout the session. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat for the speakers to see, and I will facilitate sharing those questions with both the participants and also the speakers. And we ask, again, through our years of learning, Dom Registrar from Salzburg Global Seminar has taught me to make sure that I'm an active listener and to be tough on the issues, but to be kind with each other. So it's a piece of great advice I've gotten from Dom over this last year. Also, feel free to look up World Urban Parks on Twitter at WU Parks, and also to find Salzburg Global Seminar also on Twitter at Salzburg Global. Now, I also want to share with you the 5 themes that we're going to be focusing on and that our speakers are going to talk about relative to research and evidence. And these topics include the value of parks as they relate to health and wellness, how parks are critical to childhood development, how parks drive economic opportunity, how parks unite people and strengthen communities, and how parks are essential and adaptable infrastructure that makes our communities resilient in the face of natural disasters and climate change. I also want to share with you a really key resource that World Urban Parks created actually through the pandemic. It's called the Pathway to Recovery, Wellbeing, and Resilience. And it provides key insights on parks as key health indicators, well-being indicators, sustainable development goals, and partnerships. And so the link for this is provided on the slide, and it will also be provided in the chat. So it's a great living document for you to use as we come out of this pandemic period. Now I'd like to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to transition us over to our speakers. And the first speaker I'd like to introduce again is Brice Robertson, and she's going to talk with you about evidence-based research on the connection between parks and health and wellness. Brice, welcome.
All right, thank you, Jane. Let me share my screen here. Let's see. Change all these settings. Can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I am the Director of Partnerships and Strategy with the Center for Geospatial Solutions. And that's a center that's part of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. And before that, I worked for the Trust for Public Land for 18 years. I have a background in geography and planning and GIS, so very versed on geospatial data and tools. So that's going to be my focus in this section on health benefits of parks. So you have to have parks close by to be able to use them. And we know that park access and park quality really directly affects health behaviors, whether people have a park nearby to even use, or is it the right kind of park for the types of activities that they want to engage in. And then also we know that access and quality affects health outcomes. So this is a great example here of a school playground, quote unquote, in New York City. And the teachers have to move the cars when it's time for the kids to play. And that just wasn't working well. As you can imagine, this doesn't look like a very fun place to play. And so the Trust for Public Land worked with the schools, and they've actually created over 200 of these green schoolyards in New York City. So you can see the before and after picture here of a park that is now not only available to the school children, but available to the neighborhood around there. And the park provides multiple benefits to these communities, health benefits with the trees, helping to decrease pollution. This park actually has a little garden so students can learn about growing food and healthy eating. And so, you have to really know where you need parks. And one of the things that we worked on at the Trust for Public Land is we built out these park need analyses. One was called Park Score, which ranks the 100 largest city park systems in the country and looks at park access and need based on a 10-minute walk. So who has access and who doesn't. And Park Serve did that same thing, but for all communities across the United States. And this data is readily available for anyone to use. And the red and orange areas are where you have the highest park need areas, where people don't have access to parks, but they really need them. And so data and tools like this can really help us be strategic about where we use our resources to build new parks, or where we use our operations and maintenance dollars to create or to better the parks that are there. And in addition to parks providing mental, physical, and social benefits, they also provide economic benefits. This is a report that was done for the Cleveland Metro Parks, and it showed that over $160 million were saved in medical costs per year from adults using parks for recreation purposes. So parks have a really big economic benefit related to health as well. And there are a lot of these studies out there that you can actually Google and find online, but there are organizations that are doing these types of analyses as well. So a bunch of other types of uses for health and park data. So first, we've talked about identifying the need, where parks are needed. And the maps below can show you, the map on the left shows park need by census tract. So dark or bright red shows where parks are needed the most. And the map on the right shows obesity rates by zip code. So the darker the blue, the higher the obesity rates in those communities. And you can visually see that where parks are needed most are also where you have the highest obesity rates. So data can really help us identify those places where we need to focus on for policy changes, resource changes, programming changes. Data can also help us track those changes. So if we put a park in a certain neighborhood, are we seeing the results that we wanted to see there? Identifying disparities, analyzing causes and consequences, and then also recommendations on what types of parks are needed, what types of amenities should go into parks to have those health or improvement of health impacts that we want to see. And then just wrapping it up here, I think one of the big benefits too of geospatial data is working with academics and researchers. So in this case, at the Trust for Public Land, we took our data and worked with the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research to look at, if a park is nearby, will teens use it more? And the answer is yes. And they also found that when teens engage in more recreation activities, they have lower depression rates. So, parks, data, geospatial data plus research equals evidence. And then we also are really seeing more and more data available, democratizing data. So, for example, this park prescription website has a whole section on literature reviews and databases like the Children in Nature Research Library. And then open data portals are becoming more and more prevalent too, like this California Health and Human Services Open Data Portal, where you can go and download data sets and applications that will specifically help you make the case of how parks can help improve health outcomes in your community. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Reese, thanks so much. Now I'm excited to have Irene talk about parks and their critical connection to childhood development. You're on mute, Irene.
Yeah, thank you. I will share my screen now.
Great, thanks, Irene. We can see your screen.
Thank you. I'm from Paraguay, and I apologize for having error in English maybe. I'm biologist, and I'm working from like 5 or 7 years maybe with parks, children, and botanical gardens also, in biodiversity conservation and the link with children and nature mostly. And now I just want to highlight some quick points about the importance of parks for the childhood development. And some points are parks are essential for the development of gross motor skills, and are linked also for the decrease of obesity and the sedentary lifestyle. More in nowadays that kids are very screen fun players, and they stay at home a lot of time with tablets and TV and other devices, and not sufficiently in outdoors, playing outdoors or playing free plays like I used to do in my childhood. Parks offer great opportunity for socialization. That is important too, and more for adolescents, kids, because they have very little opportunity for socialization, and now with the pandemic is worse. A lot of research demonstrate the increase of anxiety and depression in kids for being in the houses and to be prohibited to go outside and to socialize with her friends. They are linked to the increase in visual difficulties, also related to open spaces, and that is a decrease in problems like myopia, and represent a chance for connection with nature. That's what I'm working into. The opportunity to kids to know nature, to recognize animals and plants, and to be in contact with the earth, and to have a sensitive play that is something that are decreasing also in cities, the opportunity to be in contact with nature. And now we are here in Paraguay advocating for nature playgrounds. Because in the country we are used to have playgrounds with very structural playgrounds with slides and swing, but in plastic or metal, and now we are looking for more freestyle playgrounds and related to nature. And something that we are looking for is to think about park and playground that can be designed to stimulate free play, be inclusive and multi-purpose spaces, and promote outdoor learning. And that's something that we are working now in Paraguay with 11 cities and make changes in the planning of the green spaces in thinking about the change the design and the material used to construct parks. That's all. Thank you.
Irene, thank you so much. And thank you for your work in Paraguay. And in particular, you did great with your translation in English, so don't be shy.
Thank you.
Now I'm pleased to introduce Kevin Roth from the National Recreation and Park Association here in the US. And Kevin is going to talk about the connection between parks and driving economic development.
All right, thank you. Thank you again for asking me to be a part of this conversation today as I sit here and try to do two things at the same time of sharing my screen. And look at that. I hope you all see it. So, oh, hold on. Knew this was going to happen. There we go. Okay, so I've been with NRPA for about 6 years now, and one of the things I was asked to do when I came on board was to sort of build out a research group for NRPA and to help find insights to help the field, the profession, and also advocates to help make the case for greater and more sustained funding. One of the things I'll be showing today is I'm going to be showing a lot of numbers. My slides aren't as pretty, but certainly the kind of things some of the insights we've been doing. One of my insights that I've had about this field is that we have a great story. We have the numbers. We've not actually in a way sort of synthesized in a way to truly advocate in a way to kind of meet people where they are on things they understand. Hopefully they understand. And so a few of the things I'll talk about as an example come with economic opportunity. One of the things that we had not done in the past, at least at NRPA, and speaking about the United States, and I guess the other thing I should mention that while obviously this presentation is about parks, NRPA is parks and recreation, and so while they can be separate things in many ways, for us they really are one and the same. One about being about programming, and of course the important infrastructure and amenities that come with the park. So if you hear parks and recreation, please don't be thrown by that. But one of the things that we walked into a couple of years ago is, as we know that when we're making the case for funding, whether with a mayor, with maybe potential funders, we often will speak about conservation, health and wellness, and equities being our core of what Parks and Recreation really is about. But in some cases, they care about economics. And we know that when the very people we're competing with dollars for, whether it's public safety or education, they're often making those type of arguments. And so we actually did some work here to say that the Parks and Recreation also helps drive some economic activity. So we've done a couple national studies now, the most recent showing that Parks and Recreation helps generate about $166 billion in economic activity per year and is supporting 1.1 million jobs across the United States. It's not the number itself as important. Of course, it is important, but before we started saying numbers like this, the general perception is the number was zero. It may not be our strongest argument for why parks exist, but it does help make the argument for those if that's all they really care about. It isn't just NRPA that's saying numbers like this. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is as a part of the U.S. Census Bureau here in the United States, their job is to calculate the size of the U.S. economy. A couple of years ago, they started calculating I did a special report, an annual special report now on the size of the outdoor recreation economy. And what they're finding is that that entire outdoor economy helps support about 2.1% of GDP in the United States. And it's an important message to help make those investments. But sometimes it's something as simple as just talking about the size of the field. And we talk about at NRPA that there's more than 10,000 park and rec agencies across our nation, and they support more than 160,000 full-time employees and several 100,000 more employees, part-time and seasonal employees. And it kind of to show the mass of this field that does this great service. The scene behind me is a park that's literally, not even 500 yards from my house. But notice there aren't people there. You don't really make that connection about the investment that's there, the people that are a part of it. It's important for us to message that. And it's one of the things that we message out. One of the things that we look at also is understanding what drives investment. And in some cases, when we've talked to local government leaders, at least here in the US, they say one of the most important things to them, and whether we like it or not, is basically creating jobs and drawing business to their communities. So we've taken a look at that to see where that intersects with parks. We've looked at studies such as that conducted annually by a magazine. It's called Area Development, that shows that 4 out of 5 corporate executives consider quality of life as a key important factor of when they decide where to locate a new factory, a new headquarters, to expand and then relocate. What's more quality of life than parks? Are we making that connection? We then released a study that I mentioned here a few years ago, and talking to people who handle corporate relo, people who help sort of broker those types of deals, and learning about the things that they care, that kind of draws them. And one of the insights is, especially with younger generations of workers coming into the workforce, we see now is quality of life is a key factor where they choose to live, especially in this virtual world that we've shifted to in the last 13 or so months. Quality of life is playing a greater importance. And what, again, as I keep on going back to, what's more about quality of life than parks? Helping us, what's important for us is, as a national group, as the advocates that are out there throughout the nation, throughout the world, is to embrace this, that we really are a part of driving economic activity. Here in the U.S., and I'm sure across other nations too, Parks and Recreation is a leading source of first-time job for young adults. Think about that. If you have pools and there are lifeguards there, if you have park rangers or people who are helping clean, helping pick up trash and so forth in parks, often if they're teenagers or young adults, this may be one of their first jobs. Not only is there an opportunity there, perhaps, of building a lifetime relationship between parks and the young adults, but also we're teaching important life lessons about how to earn money, how to save, understand what taxes are all about, if they could take it out of your paycheck, about responsibility and about accountability. And parks and recreation are a big part of that. But this is something that can be underappreciated. And here's one that can be kind of controversial, but I'll mention it, is that Parks and Recreation have the ability to boost home values and property taxes. And I'll speak about the positive side about this for a moment, and then of course address the other part of this. We conduct annual surveys of the U.S. adult population, and we ask about the importance of having high quality parks, playgrounds, open space, rec centers, and so forth, about whether that's an important factor about where they choose to live. And you see 4 out of 5 U.S. adults say so, and we see this similar in studies conducted by other trade groups from the housing groups and so forth, how important it is. There's been a large economic literature about how there's a home value premium put on homes that are located in areas with high quality parks nearby. I cite one source here that did essentially a survey of the literature that shows an 8 to 10% adjustment. Those numbers can vary quite a bit. What's not spoken here, of course, is the potential downside, which is, of course, about gentrification and displacement. And it's something that we do need to address, something that we do need to talk about. And on one level, if left unchecked, these home price increases, higher rental prices, of course, have those detrimental effects that the members of the community, not all members of the community may be able to enjoy the benefits of park investments. So there really needs to be sort of an intentionality that comes to that as areas make these types of investments, as areas commit to high quality parks, and recreation, to ensure that all members of the community may benefit from it, whether it's through rent mitigation, increased mitigation processes, or whatever else. It's something that needs to be intentional. Displacement and gentrification don't have to necessarily be the outcome. They become the outcome when they're not considered a part of plans about investments. And we could speak hours about this topic, but nonetheless, it's something we should acknowledge. And with that, I will turn it back over to, oops, wrong button. I'm hitting the wrong button here. Here we go.
Thanks, Kevin. Irene, Brees, and Kevin, you guys have, I know, because I have spent time with all of you, just scratched the surface on the research that's available to all of us. But it's really, really critical. And thanks for highlighting health and wellness research, child development research, economic opportunities that parks provide. Now we have two other topics that we want to hit upon. And Brees, I'm going to have you talk about how parks unite people and strengthen communities.
Let's see, unmuted, and let me share my screen and the slide. Okay, parks unite people and strengthen communities. So, my work at the Trust for Public Land for almost 2 decades, we really started with community before any type of park or open space planning effort. And, really engaging the community, you have to do that now. I mean, we're not just building parks for the sake of building parks. We want to know what the community wants. And so really engaging them gets them involved in group participation. They get to meet each other and new people within the community. But I think most importantly, it really unearths this deep collective knowledge that people have, which is more important than ever now with all of the racial injustices and social injustices that we're seeing, that communities need to be a part of the process and bring their wishes and their desires to the table about what they want in their park system and for their community. These are just a few community engagement strategies that I wanted to highlight that we use at the Trust for Public Land. The first is really to inform and consult. So, get public feedback on the maps, the analysis, the designs, the results. So, a lot of times they can be part of these processes, but they can't be part of every single step of the way. So we want to make sure we're reaching out to them and informing and consulting and getting their feedback. The second is involve and collaborate. So, this is really one of the hardest and most time-consuming parts of a planning process, but it's the most important. And it's just so critical to use intensive engagement strategies throughout the entire park planning process, whether it's for one park or whether it's for a whole master park plan for your community. Engage them through the whole process. And then finally, use advocacy training tools and fiscal and policy training tools and processes to empower communities. So I think, those are just 3 examples of strategies that you can use for community engagement. And I'll give one quick example. In Los Angeles, California, at the Trust for Public Land, we worked on a project called Green Alleys. So there's over 900 linear miles of alleyways in Los Angeles. 900 linear miles, that's a lot. And most of them look like what you see back here in the background. But a lot of them actually are much worse than that. They're trash dumps, they're not safe. And the communities really wanted these spaces to be turned into safe, green, connectivity places, that they could actually use to move around in their community and to enjoy. So we brought together really a diverse group of partners that range from the city and county parks departments to public works, police and fire, local schools, community organizing groups. All of these groups came together to work on these green alleys and transform them from this. And this is an example of, you know, one of these that's pretty trashed and really not a safe place to walk through or to use, to this. So this green alley is actually, it has permeable pavers, it's got you know, vegetation, it's beautiful, and the community takes care of these alleys. And so that's another piece of the engagement process is, you know, once you've gone through the planning, the building, or the renovation process, then you have to take care of these parks or alleys or trails, and really engage in the community to do that. Gives them a sense of empowerment and ownership of these places. And then because I have this GIS background, I have to also talk about, you know, not only engaging communities directly, there are ways to use technology to engage communities. And using GIS, more than ever, it's so easy to create these apps that people can take out on their phone into parks to give you feedback about the park. So in this example, we created an application for the park system in Dallas, Texas. And we had several events and asked community members to come out. And we had hundreds of people that showed up on Saturdays, downloaded this app, and then they traveled out to the different parks and told us, you know, what's the quality of the park? What kind of amenities are there? What kind of amenities do you want there that aren't currently there? So GIS and technology can be a really good way also to engage communities through your processes. And then just ending on strong partnerships of many types. So there's engaging the community, but there's also building out partnerships that are going to help us you know, maintain or update our park systems or manage our park systems. And those can be public-private partnerships, friends of groups. You know, we can engage sectors that we might not have ever engaged before, like the health sectors or the schools. And then volunteers are so important too. So on an ongoing basis, it was estimated a couple of years ago that 17 million hours per year of volunteer hours were used specifically for parks in the 100 largest cities in the country. And I think that equated to over $450 million worth of volunteer hours. And so really engaging communities on a volunteer basis can not only help you, but back to Kevin's point about economics, can really you know, be a big economic benefit to your community as well.
Thanks, Bruce.
Right.
Again, some really critical and important research that you've done. Thank you for sharing that. And our last topic is going to be about how parks are essential and provide adaptable infrastructure that makes our communities resilient in the face of natural disasters and climate change. Kevin, you're up.
All right, let's see if we can do this correctly again one more time. There we go. And we hit that. And we hit this. Okay. Awesome. So again, this is kind of feeding back on some work that NRPA has been doing. And I guess to give a little bit of context for these 5 areas that we're chatting about today, we're bringing out a resource of sort of some key talking points behind all this. And so I'm actually speaking to those talking points at the end of the day. So when we talk about, actually going back to what we're talking about is that how parks are essential and adaptable infrastructure. This is really kind of really critical way to kind of to view parks in a way that perhaps is a bit of a shift for many of us. We often use the word amenities, and I don't necessarily want to run away from amenities, but unfortunately, sometimes amenities is kind of like the word fun, where parks are about fun and play, but sometimes they're not taken seriously. And I think that probably the word amenities sometimes has that same effect, but the parks are actually critical infrastructure in our communities also. And especially in the context of helping with climate change, with mitigating the impacts of disasters and so forth. So one of the things that we're doing as a talking point is talking about the size, the mass of what Parks and Recreation actually is. And so one of the ways I mentioned a little bit earlier that there, at least in the United States, there are 10,000 or so local park and rec agencies throughout our nation, which in itself is an enormous number, and showing how they are in every community across the nation, or just about every community across the nation. In some, we estimate, and it's a ballparkish number, but we estimate that just local park and recreation agencies themselves manage more than 11 million acres of parkland and open space. And that's probably at least on a local government level. I mean, that's a very sizable part of their infrastructure. The typical agency can dramatically vary by size, and it's one of the things we try to communicate to the public, to potential funders, to even political stakeholders about what it means. And so a typical agency may manage 74 parks and 32 acres of land, but in some cases, those agencies are managing 10 times as amount of acres of land in their community. Because of this, the amount of parkland that they control, the amount of open space that they manage, they deliver proven, cost-effective, sustainable environmental solutions. We have a toolkit here that I mentioned that helps communicate some of these key points with research behind it. But basically, the key points are that the tree canopy that comes from parks will help lower ground temperatures, help clean the water, help reduce flooding. The green infrastructure projects that are part of Parks and Recreation departments these days have a real impact in mitigating stormwater issues in the community. And of course, those trees, the open space, and so forth help result in the healthier air. And again, this toolkit here is one of the things that we use to help our members, to help park and recreation professionals, park and recreation advocates, to communicate this again to key stakeholders, whether they're political leaders, funders, or just trying to convince a neighbor next door how important those parks really are. We know that, as mentioned a little bit earlier, people with access to parks and green space live longer, healthier lives. That same toolkit I mentioned talk about the improved mental health benefits that come from parks, the improved physical health, the increased physical activity. We know over the last year, the communities during the pandemic, in communities where there was sufficient parkland, that those parks were being loved, in some cases maybe being loved to death by increased usage. As everything else closed, especially during the opening months of the pandemic, the thing that stayed open were the parks. The things that stayed open were those trails, and we know that people were embracing it during this incredibly stressful period. The parks were a salvation for many people, and hopefully that's not going to be forgotten as we come out of this pandemic and the resulting economic turmoil. And also one of the things that we also do in this context is, as I mentioned before, we often like to take the words of people. I had the opportunity to do this presentation 14 hours ago also. And one of the things I talked about there is that something that we as a field don't embrace enough, but is really true, is it turns out people like parks. It turns out that probably almost anything else that's out there that has an advocacy group out there. Here, I live in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a trade association for literally anything you can possibly think of. But we're one of the few groups out there that has no negative constituency. No one dislikes parks. There may be someone have an individual issue of something, but that's not the point. The concept of parks and recreation, people agree with. Not everyone's passionate about it. But one of the things we've learned to do in recent years is to take their words and put it back and give it back to them to explain to them. So one of the things here is that we've been running surveys and so forth, and we know that we hear back. The U.S. adults agree that's critical for local governments to develop parks and trails and green spaces nearby as a water to help protect natural resources in their community. And this is true by age, this is true by income level, this is true by political reasons or political persuasion and so forth. People agree with this. The same thing about the second point there. The overwhelming majority of U.S. adults agree and support their agencies, park and rec agencies work on the economic, environmental initiatives like wildlife conservation, educating the public on environmental issues, natural resource management. Again, crossing every political spectrum, crossing age and income and so forth like this. People support this work. People agree with it. Not everyone has access to it, but they want access to it. And I think the last thing here, and this is something the lesson of the past year, and I hope it's been true elsewhere, but at least here in the U.S., Parks and Recreation has been playing a critical role in their community's pandemic emergency response. 40% of agencies, we've been running surveys, especially in the early months of the pandemic, finding out what people were doing. It's just part of an information exchange among park and rec leaders. And many agencies were a big part of their community's pandemic response. So it's critical infrastructure in terms of providing opportunities for getting a chance to walk outside, to exercise the environmental benefits, but also this same infrastructure served an important role about how the communities were attacking this public health emergency that we've all been living through. And that's something to live forward, to be communicating forward as we come out of this pandemic, that these resources have so many different roles, and including as a part of that emergency response. And it's why it's such a critical infrastructure. And with that, there's my address, and I'll unshare my screen.
Thank you, Kevin. And I just want to give a hats off to all three of you, Irene, Brice, and Kevin. Thank you for both the work you do, but also what you've shared with us today. So it looks like we have at least one question in the chat. It's a comment and then a question. So this, I think, is for all of you. This individual loves the concept of the 10, 20, 30-minute park. The question is, what apps are you actually using to find parks and identify nature? Google Maps, iNaturalist, Seek. What do you each use? I'll open it up to all three of you.
Well, I guess I'll start. I use ArcGIS. Esri is the company that makes the GIS software. And that's what we use to actually analyze the 10-minute walk. But you can choose any kind of buffer that you want to use. But the nice thing about the GIS software is it doesn't just create a circular buffer around a park. You can actually use something called Network Analyst that creates a walkable buffer around the park. So the model takes into account barriers for walking, like rivers or 6-lane highways, things like that. And it uses the road and the sidewalk network to actually create that buffer. So you get a much more accurate portrayal of walkability to a park. And then they also have some really, now more than ever, people hear GIS and I think people still think, oh, that's such a hard software to use. But more than ever, they have these out of the box configurable apps, and they have one for a park finder app where you can put your data, and I put several links into the chat there that you could go check out, but you can put your data into those park apps and make them available to your community. So that's the software that I use.
Thanks. Brice, Irene, what about you? I know you're a biologist, so you may not use land-based software, but I'm curious if you do and what you do use.
Yes, for identifying nature, we use a lot of eNaturalist to have a portrait of the nature where we are, and it's very useful. It's a very useful tool for non-expert and for experts, and I use a lot here in Paraguay that.
Thanks, Irene. And what about you, Kevin?
While I'll play with some of the tools that Brice talks about, at the end of the day, probably it really is Google Maps. It's kind of interesting you bring that up, because a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity at NRPA to attend an event we had on data. And we heard about how that city that was hosting that event talked about how, when it was either Google Maps or Apple Maps decided they were going to start tracking transit information, how they essentially got a call out of the blue one day and basically was asked for certain information because they were going to begin to populate that. And I kind of look forward to that day when that possibly could happen with park and rec agencies, perhaps at some level. Not necessarily that I want to see our agencies lose control of that information, but to have, we all use these tools today, and to have to have set information that can be available, whether it's in Google or Apple Maps or someplace else, that can really be universal across all parks, regardless of who owns it, whether it's a local, state, or federal issue in the United States, or whatever the government structure is elsewhere. I think is really kind of critical, because when I think about looking at transit information out in many large cities now, it's pretty uniform, and they explained how they did it. I mean, it's pretty remarkable and made it easy for the agencies. And so it's just a matter of time, I think, before one of those two map companies do the same thing.
Thanks, Kevin. Really good points. Really good points. So, Brice, a question is the GIS software available to the public?
It is. I mean, there's a cost for it, but if you're an individual and you're not using it for commercial uses, they make it really affordable at $100 a license. And then if you're a nonprofit, they have a nonprofit program that also makes it very affordable. But most agencies, it is, Esri's ArcGIS is the #1 mapping software used by agencies worldwide. And so your agency might actually have it and could give you access to that.
Well, thanks, Brice. So, we have 2 of our speakers are from the United States, and Irene is from South America and Paraguay. But we have participants in the session who are from other parts of the world. And while in particular, Brice's and Kevin's focus has been on the US, and Irene's has been focused on the work she's doing in Paraguay, I would imagine that our participants are interested to know the focus areas that you each are working on, if you're familiar with what else that kind of work is being done elsewhere in the world, so that if we've got attendees from Asia Pacific or from Europe or from Canada or Mexico, if you are aware of other people and other resources that are available in your area of expertise. So Irene, I'll open up to you first. Given the work that you're doing on children and play, what you're familiar with other opportunities that people may be able to get other research or evidence from other parts of the world.
We are working a lot with eClay, with a lot of evidence about the local governments and changes in urban planning and parks, and also trying to make cities more biodiverse and make parks places to conserve biodiversity. Not only places for walking or doing exercise or socializing, but thinking about the potential of cities to conserve biodiversity, and also very much to connect this biodiversity to people, because it's more easy to visit a urban park than a national park that is very far away, and the urban parks can have the opportunity to engage more people for conservation purposes. And in Latin America, we are trying to change the vision of the parks and to have more parks that are actually protected areas, formal protected areas in cities, and like in Chile or in Argentina, and we are working in this way.
Thanks, Irene. Kevin or Brice? Again, the question was, are you aware of other countries and other research that's available for people in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so I'm now working with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who has a global footprint, whereas before at the Trust for Public Land, we were focused on the United States. And we are working with groups all over the world through the International Land Conservation Network, which looks at parks and open spaces, trails, all kinds of protected lands, both public and privately protected lands. And I think there's over 4,000 or so members of this network, and we're talking a lot about how we can use data and technology to, number one, have a good accounting system of what is protected, you know, both in the urban areas, but also in the more wilderness areas. So we're working towards that, and that's really important. I think everybody's probably familiar with the 30 by 30 and half Earth goals that, you know, we really need to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, 50% by 2050 to avert catastrophic biodiversity loss and climate catastrophe and collapse. And parks are a huge piece of that, but yet we don't yet have a global account of an accurate global account of what's already protected. So we're working hard, you know, to get that database put together, but then we're also working hard to use that data and other information about threats and needs and all types of things to identify where new parks and open spaces can and should go to meet those goals.
Thanks, Bruce. Kevin, I'm going to pivot and ask you a different question. One of the attendees or participants wants to know if you can share examples of urban green spaces being linked with conserved areas to reduce habitat fragmentation or improve biodiversity corridors.
I don't know. I'll be really frank with you.
It's probably outside of what NRPA is doing, isn't it?
It is a bit, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I can't give a good answer.
That's okay. Bruce, is that something that you would be familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples of that all across the country and the world, really. I think, you know, ESRI actually has created a green infrastructure map that shows the corridors and connections between places that are already protected. And so I think, you know, there are data sets out there that can show us where those places are happening, but or where that type of land protection is happening, but also know that it's happening hyper local, you know, and you know, there's like the India Basin and San Francisco Bay Area. That's going to be a critical protected, connected area. There's just so many examples. I think maybe we need to put together a repository of all of them.
All right, thanks, Bruce. Here's another question I think for all of you. You know, how do you, or if you're not doing it, how would you build the case for using these 5 themes that we talked about today for equity and accessibility for everyone to parks, whether they're local, regional, or national, and in particular, that are these parks that are thinking of imposing user fees to the public. When we think about parks, and I think particularly in the United States, we think about the fact that parks are available to everyone. And yet there's this whole idea that, in fact, our national parks do it, and some of our larger regional parks impose user fees. And how does that play out with these data points, and particularly with accessibility to all and equity? Just curious what you guys think about that.
It's something we talk quite a bit about, and it's something we track in some of our benchmarking data. I mean, fortunately, most, but not all, local park and rec agencies don't charge much for anything, at least in terms of access to open space, although there are exceptions. You talk about large regional parks. One of the things also, I guess the caveat also would say is, what's disturbing about what you just described sometimes also it's one thing to be collecting funds if it's actually really meant to be helping the park and rec agency. But unfortunately, in some cases, local park and rec agencies don't even own the revenue that they collect. It's actually just going into the general fund of the city. So you may be collecting fees for maybe accessing the parking lot, or for other ways that agencies can raise money, whether it's registration fees or even concessions or something like that. And it's just going back to the mayor, who can use it as they see best fit, which often is not the park and rec agency, unfortunately. having said all that, and something I had said this morning also, parks and recreation, park space and open space is democratic space, and small d democratic space, we should say in terms of the United States. And it is truly meant for all. And when you have fees often, or maybe licensing requirements, maybe for some activities that may occur in parks, it has to impact, whether by design or just by negligence, I guess, of actually keeping people out. And maybe at times you need to raise funds, and maybe those fees need to exist. But I mean, there's a real cost that come along with those charges. And so it's not as simple, especially again, what that thing is saying. Most of the time, and many times, that agency doesn't even get to keep that money anyways. And so it really is just trying to milk this resource, and it's taking away from what is supposed to be democratic space. And the thing is, I guess the last thing is kind of the way how you can handle it. We've done a lot of research, and we've asked, again, US-centric, and I'll acknowledge that again. When we describe what the typical agency spends a year, which is a little less than $7 per month per capita of residents for how much what the agency's operating budget is, which is not necessarily a lot of money by most views. It surprises people when we point that out. When we ask them, well, what do you think we could raise that 5% or 10%? Would you be okay? Would you be willing to pay an extra $1 or $2 a month per capita? And people say, absolutely, it's absolutely worth it. So the taxpayer, at least in this nation, is willing to pay a few more dollars for parks and recreation. And it's something we should be willing to embrace. Parks tend to be about 2% of a local government's budget anyways. Surely we can make that 2.5% or 3%. So.
Yeah, very good point. Irene or Bruce, any closing remarks that you'd like to make, again, around this topic of research and evidence-based work that our participants can use as their elevator pitches, or to advocate more for parks and open spaces? No pressure.
I'll go. So I guess, I would say it's just so important. Parks are really tier 1 solutions to a lot of the problems that we have in our cities, and they're treated like tier 2 solutions right now. And to Kevin's point, the budgets are lower, and we saw through COVID, they were the first to get cut. And, we can't treat parks and open spaces and nature that way. They have to be a very core part of our communities. And when we can expand out beyond just thinking of parks as a place to recreate, but thinking of them in these multi-benefit, through these multi-benefit lenses we've talked about today, I think that's when we're really going to start to, their parks are going to get the respect that they deserve. So.
Thank you, Reese, Irene, and Kevin. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time today, sharing your knowledge and expertise. Participants, all of their email addresses are in the chat room. And I hope that all of you have come away with more data and materials you can use to pitch your arguments that we all know. We're speaking to the choir to this group of why parks and green spaces are so important. Research, and data, I think, is vitally important and is critical today. So thank you all. No matter where you are coming from the world, have a great evening, afternoon, or morning. And thank you for joining us. And go to World Urban Parks website for more activities and webinars that are going on around the world for World at Parks Week. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, Dom. Thanks for hanging out and staying up late.
Hey, Jane, that was really good. That was excellent.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a
All
good
right.
night. Go to
You too.
bed.
See you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.